Hi, how are you? Hope you're doing well. So, we continue our talk concerning making an effective lesson plan, and today we are in the fifth part, and we are going to talk about like practically how you are going to design a lesson plan. So, last time we have dealt with cross-curricular competencies. We talked about the idea of a sequence. We talked about the objectives. We talked about that we should divide the whole sequence into lessons. So we talked about lessons, for example, listen and speak and read and write. Today we are going to talk about the structure of the lessons themselves. You see, let's say, for example, we want to start with listen and speak. So you would assume that in this kind of lesson, the targeted competencies are listening and speaking. Of course, we would start with listening. And in this regard, often we use terms like PDP, we use like PPU for the framework for the whole lesson. So what do we mean by these? Now, so let's talk about the structure or the stages. For example, in the case with in a lesson, of course, we would start with warm up. Although I'm going to come back to this idea, I don't want to talk about it now. So let's talk about PDP. What is PDP in general? It is just a kind of acronym for pre-listening or reading, during reading and listening, and post-reading and listening. So why do we need it, and what do we mean by it? You see, in communicative approach in general, every activity or every task is is set or designed for a purpose. It's not just we want to install resources in terms of language structure, but in fact, we want to have a communicative ideas in that task. So if you want your learners to listen, even that listening activity, it should have a purpose. So we said it should have a purpose. That's the same thing concerning reading. So because we use BDP usually with listening or reading. So if you want an activity and you want your learners to listen to that activity, you would start not by letting your learners listening, for example, to a certain speech or any kind of, I don't know, maybe you have something and your learners are going to listen to. But it would make sense to start with the pre-listening activity. That pre-listening activity is going to set kind of a purpose to the listening. For example, I'm going to present my learners with a dialogue. They are going to listen to a dialogue. Before they listen to the dialogue, you would start with an activity, usually asking questions before even your learner is going to introduce to that dialogue. For example, let's say, for example, who are the speakers of the dialogue? Maybe you are going to ask about the context, etc. So maybe you are even going to put questions and your learners are going to listen to the dialogue and answer the question. So that's why the pre-listening or pre-reading task is very important. Usually in the reading, you are going to give your learners set of questions, and these questions your learners are going to listen. So it's kind of you give a purpose to the activity of listening itself. Now, during the reading, and here sometimes you find confusion that some they tell you that the questions are the during. No, during reading, and the learners are reading, and at the same time they are doing a task. For example, you can give them a table. For example, if you are talking about primary school, you present a dialogue. In the dialogue, you have information, basic information, and your learners are going to have a table, and they are going to fill in the table with information they hear from that dialogue. The same thing concerning can be in anything. Of course, it can be more complex. For example, it can be even information about anticipating the end of a story or something like this. So that's during. Now, the post listening, you had a question. Let's say, for example, if we are talking about primary, even or talking about middle school, you would present questions. And in this question, for example, you said one student or learner is introducing him or herself in the dialogue. They listen to the dialogue. They fill in a table from the dialogue they have just heard. Now, maybe in the post reading, they use the same table, but in this case, they fill in their own information and then they do what you call the reverse. I always call this the reverse. So now they make like a text or a speech about themselves. So it starts by listening and it ends usually with speaking, because this is why I said listening, listen and speak. So it starts with listen, they elicit the pattern from the questions they get information from it, they understand how to get information, then they understand how to use this information, then again they produce it again to you. This is how I usually do it, especially with middle school or primary school. Of course, this can be complex when it comes to secondary school. So this is the pre-listening, during reading or listening, and the post-reading. Of course, now it is the idea of the warm-up. Here, the idea of warm-up is very, very important. Usually the warm-up here I use it to not only just to warm up or to engage the learners. Sometimes I introduce new vocabulary. For example, I give them like the pictures and I said, can you match the pictures with the words? But those pictures they are kind of complex words that are in the text, and I'm sure that my learners are not going to understand them. So I kind of introduce them at the level of the warm up. This is so important because the warm up, it can be like that stage that can sorry, what can I say? It means the success or the failure of your lesson overall. Of course, it has other benefits. Maybe I'm going to talk about them in other videos. That's concerning the PDP. Now, the PPU, I would say things are a bit different here. So in the PPU, we have what we call the presentation, then you have the practice and the use. And often we use that in the grammar or to install resources. Some they said it's the practice. Now, what I want to tell you here, the presentation, if you have done your reading session in a good way and your listening session in a good way, it's like both these sessions that are going to be considered the presentation. You would ask only your learners to bring like some examples from the reading session and also from the listening session, and you would have no problem because you have already presented all the essential examples from both lessons. That's why I said when you design the whole sequence and you have in mind all the lessons, you won't have any problem. So the presentation and the practice use is often used when you want to talk about resources, like you have resources in mind. For example, you have done a reading session about presenting yourself or a listening session about presenting yourself. Then in the practice session, you are going to talk about the present simple, for example. In this case of the present simple, you have already shown your learners how to use, like, for example, I am, he is, she is, etc. So this is concerning the PDP and the PPU session. Of course, I'm going to talk about and further about the warm-up because the warm-up is very, very important. So thank you so much and see you on my next video. Goodbye.